everyone. Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. Wonderful to see so many familiar faces, which I've missed all summer, and wonderful to see new faces. And I'm excited to be here with you and learn together. If there's problems with hearing me, please wave at me or something like that to give me a sense of what's going on. I am so confused by all the various pieces of machinery around me that I'm not sure what to do. I'm like trying not to be poked in the eye mostly. I'm trying. Is this better? Okay. Yes? Okay. I want to start by saying that we're dedicating our learning today to the memory of Rav Avi Goldberg, Rav Avraham Yosef Goldberg, Hashem Yikom Damo, who, besides being a very, very beloved member of my community, husband of a dear friend, son-in-law of one of the women behind Matan, Francie Wolf, and a wonderful neighbor, was also someone who brought light and goodness to the world, even to people who didn't know him well. To meet Rav Avi in the street was to feel uplifted, because how can you not feel uplifted when someone looks at you with so much genuine interest and love and goodwill? To talk to him was to feel your spirits well, because how can you not feel your spirits well, even in the darkest of time, and we had many very dark times this year, when he has such clarity of vision about our journey as a people towards redemption, about how we will in fact get to a better time, how we can rise to the moment and its challenges, how we can, despite all the difficulty, keep going. And the gifts he gave us, those who knew him and those who knew him through writing or through teaching, in offering us this clarity of vision and this encouragement and this sense of uplift, is especially needed right now because we lost him and we miss him, and it's up to us to uplift ourselves and each other. And I wanted to dedicate this lesson to his memory. And as I wrote here, may we merit to see, do, and speak good in his memory. May we merit to offer each other solace, strength, and what we need to make this world a better place. And without further ado, I will say that there are many journeys that humanity embarks on from its creation. We're reading now the parashot of the beginning of biblical history, right? So from the moment man is created, there's been many journeys, many, goals that we've strove towards and continue to strive towards. The one this particular course is going to talk about or focus on is family stories. From the beginning of humanity, we start the great journey towards learning how to form families, understanding what families offer to you, more often than not learning how not to manage your family affairs. Tolstoy's family line that every happy family is happy in the same, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, is happy in the same way, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own ways. We will, over the course of this year, encounter many uniquely unhappy families. Let's leave it at that. However, through the unhappiness, through the difficulties, through the competition, through the estrangements, we, as readers of Tanakh and as human beings, learn just how much family can give a person and how to strive towards achieving that, how to strive towards building a family in a way that will achieve that. And today, we will ask a question: where does this journey begin? The journey towards building families, the journey towards figuring out how to structure the relationships within a family in a way that will be healthy, good, growth-oriented, et cetera, all the good adjectives you can add there. And when asked this question, where does this journey begin? I went to the beginning, to Bereshit Aleph. And I want us to look together at Bereshit Aleph and wonder if the story of relationships really does start there. Let's look at the moment when God creates man. I'm in box number 1. I'll read in English. Sometimes I'll transition to the Hebrew. You have both before you. God said, "Let the earth bring forth every kind of living creatures, cattle, creeping things, and wild beasts of every kind." And it was so. God made wild beasts of every kind and cattle of every kind and all kinds of creeping things of the earth. And God saw that this was good. Vayar Elokim ki tov. And God said, "Let us make a man in our image, after a likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth." And God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fertile and increase. Fill the earth and master it, and rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on earth." God said, "See, I give you every seed-bearing plant that is upon all the earth, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit. They shall be yours for food. And to all the animals on land, to all the birds of the sky, and to everything that creeps on earth, in which there is a breath of life, I give all the green plants for food." And it was so. Vayehi ken. Is this, in fact, the bedrock of relationships? On the one hand, the main actors are already in place, right? We have man, we have woman. They're not named like this yet. What they're called here is Adam, Zachar v'Nekeva, right? The male and female of Adam. They're not Ish ve'Isha. We'll get to the Ish ve'Isha moment later. But they're there. They're obviously meant to procreate, right? As God, the first thing God tells them is Pru urvu milu et haaretz, meaning they're supposed to notice each other's existence and bring into existence more human life. And one might well think that this is it. This is the beginning moment. Except as many, many commentators pointed out, both classical and modern, all those ingredients that we consider actually crucial for relationship are not there. The people are there. The understanding that there's a biological process by which they will create new life is there. But this does, male, female, and procreation, not a family make. For one, they don't have a voice. God is speaking, God is ordering, God is saying, and whatever he says happens, right? It says, "Vayehi chen, vayehi chen, vayehi chen," and so it was, and so it was. But humanity doesn't have a speaking part. If this was a play, for example, on stage, you would say that humanity is the extras. They're just there to be kind of part of the props. God is the only speaking part. God is the only hero. It's really a monologue to a great extent. Here's another thing. It's not only that they don't have a voice. At no point do we hear that they have, that they express even in nonverbal ways or expected to express in nonverbal ways a sense of their relation to someone or something else. Now, what do I mean? God does express a sense of relation. He says, "I will make man in my image," right? God is seeing humanity and has a certain intention for it and a certain communication to it and a certain understanding of where it should fit into the world. Humanity doesn't seem to have a consumer, I'm losing my words here, an answering sense of where they are in the world, at least that they express. They also don't seem to have any sense of each other. They're created in this sterile way, male and female, and they're told, "You have to procreate." But, if they're both standing there, imagine it physically. They're both standing there looking at God. We know God doesn't have a face, but bear with me. They're standing there looking at God. At no point do we get a sense that they're looking at each other. Like, there's no conversation. There's no moment of encounter. There's no attraction even. There's just the awesome duty delivered from above to below, from God to humanity, And humanity is just expected to follow this awesome duty, which includes procreation, but there's no sense that it means anything to them. In many ways, I think that Genesis 1 gives us the biological facts of life. It gives us the predetermined urges, instincts, behavioral patterns that are just part of the animal world. Creatures procreate. Sex and death are the big dramas that happen in existence. Death, not yet, but relations. But it doesn't give us humanity as people with individual personalities. And without individual personalities, family life can't quite arise. Procreation can, but not family life. But this is not the end of the story, because famously, the Torah then gives us another creation story that is profoundly different. And all the things that we noted were not there in the first creation story: voice, personality, relation, sense of relation, looking at each other or relating to one another in any way. All of that enters into the story in a big way in Bereshit Bet. Let's look at the bottom of box 1. So the Lord God cast a deep sleep upon the man, and while he slept, he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh at that spot. And the Lord God fashioned the rib that he had taken from the man into a woman, and he brought her to the man. Then the man said, "This one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for from man she was taken." Hence, a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, so that they become one flesh. The two of them were naked, the man and his wife, yet they felt it got cut off. No, it's here. It's just got cut off. Shame. They knew no shame. There is so much in this, it's 4 verses. It's just 4 verses, but there's so much in it. There's a sense of discovery, of man noticing the woman, right? He's asleep and he wakes up and there she is. And the sleep is almost the act of waking up is almost a metaphor for the sense of discovery, of noticing another human being. I don't know about you, but I have a very vivid memory. Forgive me for straying a little bit from the Torah into personal history, but I have this vivid memory of when I was very young, I don't know, 6 maybe, sitting at the kitchen table at my parents' house, eating breakfast with my sister across from me. My sister is 2 years younger. And I remember, as if it's today, that I looked at her and suddenly had the mind-blowing realization that just like I have a voice in my head talking and telling me things and thoughts and fears, she must have it also. And I remember it vividly because until that moment, I just saw her and she was there. She was always there for as long as I remember. I don't remember before I was 2. She was always just there. And on that day, she looked the same. Nothing changed. She's still the same. But I suddenly became aware that if I have an internal world, I didn't have the words to put it like that, but she must have an internal world. And I remember for days and weeks afterwards, whenever we would, let's say, walk around in the playground or go to school, to a kindergarten, or travel in the car, staring at people around me and saying, they must have a voice in their head also, and she must have a voice in her head, and he must have, and it felt overwhelming that there can be so many people in the world, and each of them with their own internal world. Think how many worlds are in this room right now, just right now. So when I read this moment of Adam waking up, I feel like it's that. It's the paradigm, the archetype of that moment when you wake up from the sleep of lack of awareness, of thinking of yourself kind of alone in the world, and everything else is just there, the props of your own internal monologue, and you love them or hate them or want something from them. You want your mother, you want something from your father, you want something from your siblings, but they're just there. To that startling realization of, this is a whole separate human being looking back at me from those eyes. So Adam is having this moment, and he has a voice in this process. He exclaims, "This time, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh." He recognizes the deep affinity he has with Eve. And he does something fascinating. He changes his name. Until this moment, he's described as Adam, right? What does Adam stand for? Where does the word come from? Adama. It's his origin, right? He is Adam because he came from Adama. Then he looks at this new and startling creature, this new human, this new Bat Adam, or not Bat, whatever. And he says, it's hard because that's when words come into being. So there's no word for what was before. But what does he say? He says, Lazot ikare isha. He gives her a name. But why? Ki meish lukacha zot. He names her after him because just like he was taken from Adama, so he's Adam, she is taken from Ish, right? She's his rib, literally. So she should be Isha. But almost without noticing, he also refers to himself by this new name, right? He doesn't say Adam, ki me Adam lukacha zot. He is the one naming himself Ish, even as he is naming her Isha. It's like he is somehow transcending his Adam state. He is transforming through the relationship. By the way, I think the next verse makes it even more explicit because the next verse is clearly an editorial intervention. It says, in 24, Al ken ya'azov ish et aviv et imo, v'davak be'ishto v'ayu lebasar echad. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Obviously, it's not about Adam. He had no father and mother, right? It's not in the flow of the story. It's like we take a step back. This intervention makes us take a step back and say, what we're watching here is going to be the paradigm for any spousal relationship, marital relationship ever. But in what way did Adam leave his mother and father? Through the naming, because he's named for his origins. He's named Adam. And now he's naming himself for his marriage unit, for his, I mean, it's not marriage at this point, but for his marital relationship, right? He's naming himself Ish to match the Isha that's created out of him. And he may not, it's not just that he cleaves onto her and becomes one flesh. He cleaves onto her and they become one word, one root. To understand the weight of it, I invite you to think back to Bereshit Aleph. How is the world created? Through language. God says words and the words become reality. They become atoms. They become cells. They become concrete. So when Adam imitates him, he does imitatio Dei. He imitates God. He plays a creative role and he recreates himself in the woman's image in an odd way. This is already a very, very different basis, I think, for the birth of relationship, of connection between humans than the cold, pragmatic, mechanical, almost introduction of humanity in the previous chapter. And the question is for me, because when I look at it, I don't look at it just as a Torah reader. I look at it as a person who's meant to learn something from it about my own relationship and how I'm supposed to relate to other people. The question I want to ask myself and I want to raise with you is, what is it that makes Adam, or Ish as he becomes, capable of a relationship here in a way he was not capable of a relationship in Bereshit Aleph? What changed? What is it that enables this kind of relational awareness between people? And I want to, before we delve into one possible answer, I want to raise this question to you. Does anyone want to offer a thought? Yes. And I will repeat for the Zoom. Yes. Because we don't know how to realize that she was bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh. You're saying, is it possible that God communicated with him that he took her from his bone and flesh, since we don't see it happen on stage? Obviously, it's possible. I think the fact that it's not mentioned is actually very significant, because what it tells us is if we just accept the pshat as is and assume that since the whole operation happened while Adam was asleep and he wasn't present for it on some deep level, we must assume that his act of recognition comes from his own intuition and not through God's guidance. And Communication, thank you. So it's less communication, there's some intuition. He sees her and there's some spark of recognition. And I think you're deepening the question in a sense, because you're saying without this communication, how does he know? And how does it fit? So I'll come back to it after. I want to hear some more thoughts. Yes.
Something else.
That's a beautiful thought. You're saying that sacrifice is the answer. Adam gave something up. He is missing a rib. He may not know exactly how it happened or what it happened or what it signifies, since God doesn't communicate, at least not on stage, but something was given up. And perhaps the lesson for us is that you can only be open to relationship when you're not whole, when you made a crack, when you gave something and made a crack for the light to come through, so to speak. I think that's really profound, and we'll come back to that as well. Yes.
Says, though Adam zot kapah etzemei. So that means that there was something else before that wasn't this kind of communication between two entities. I mean, this time he senses that there is something binding for him. The fact that she is part of him, but somehow you get the idea that you didn't sense that before.
So you're making a very fine point. You're saying that you're noting the words zot hapam, this time. It implies that there were other attempts, or that there was some search earlier and that things didn't match. And we'll get back to that. We'll get back to the training period that God puts man through in order to know through negation, like through the experience of not fitting, what it is that it fits. By the way, in more Kabbalistic, Midrashic readings, there's a whole theory about Lilith being there first, and we're not going to go there. We're going to stick with the Pshat right now. Yes.
So Parv and Nekeva was really one entity attached to each other, so they never saw each other. They faced outward, like through them, kind of. So here Hashem made Havdalah, like he did in the beginning of creation with everything. Every time he separated. So maybe now they were facing each other because there was a separation between the two.
So you're quoting, I think I actually have it here in the source sheet. So if I do, let's go look at it for a second. Let me just find where it is. There's a famous midrash that, in trying to make sense of why there's two creation stories, right? Why it's two, yeah, it's in page 5, box 6. In trying to make sense of why there's these two creation stories, suggested that the first creation story created a whole human being that had a male side and a female side. And the second creation story is the separation. It's not just one rib, it's like a whole being that's carved in two, and now can look at each other. They can turn inwards. Let's read it here in Bereshit Rabbah 8. It's in the middle of box 6. Said Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Elazar, in the hour when the Holy One created the first human, he created him as an androgynous, as it is said, male and female, he created them. Said Rabbi Shmuel bar Nechmani, in the hour when the Holy One created the first human, he created for him a double face and sawed him and made him backs, a back here and a back there, as it is said, back aho and back kadam, you formed me. And then here, God kind of does the first medical intervention in human history. Uses anesthesia, right? He puts men to sleep, he puts them to sleep and separates them. And then the language difference makes more sense because he can no longer just be Adam. Both of them are Adam. So we need a new way to refer to the two parts of Adam. This is a more midrashic reading. I like it personally. I find it very profound. Let's go back to the pshat though. Anybody, I see a lot of answers. I'm not going to be able to call on all of you. I apologize in advance. I'll call on 2 more people and then we'll continue. Yes.
Sees the rest of the world. He's seen something that was there before him. This is something that comes after him. And it says here that God brought her to the man. He sees her coming from outside. Maybe he senses that it's coming from God, and maybe that's what creates the relationship.
You're pointing out something really important about the order of creation, which is often ignored, namely that Adam is created into the world without Chava in the second creation story, right? In the first creation story, they show up together. In the second creation story, Adam is created. He already knows what's there. We'll go later back to the beginning of the text and we'll see how God takes him and asks him to name all the animals. He gives him, that's what I referred to when I said God training him. God made him look at all the animals and look for Ezer Kenegdo. Look for a helpmate amongst the animals, and men saw that neither of them fit, which helps understand the Zot Hapam later. But as you pointed out, it's not just that she's different, that she is the one that matches him. She appears seemingly out of nowhere in a world he already knows well. It's a world that he knows, he mapped out, he understands how it works. And suddenly there's something new and startling in this world. And maybe that's what enables this sense of recognition, this sense of, oh, we're meant to do something together. Going back to the psychology of it for a second and to our own personal experience, since I really do think this is meant to be not just a story of the creation of humanity, but a story, the mega story, the meta story of our relationships. I think that this story emphasizes, following your point about the newness of the woman, that relationships depend on the ability to accept new information. I will explain, to absorb that something in the world is not necessarily exactly how you thought it is or imagined it is. I mean, I think we've all been in relationship or seen how relationships go when one person is convinced that they know how everything works and the other person doesn't have any insight to offer, that isn't by definition inferior and unneeded because this person knows what's needed. I think a lot of teenagers go through this stage. That's part of the trial and error of growing up, of figuring out that to really be in a relationship, you need to make room for being surprised, for being shown a better way, for being shown that some things that you think you know how to do, maybe there's a better way to do them. And maybe this newness of of Isha at this point is an avatar for that experience of all generations that followed. One last comment over there, and then I'm sorry, we'll have to continue.
Play over here. We have to go back to the word Tardema and Vayiven, because everything changes with Tardema. The world was known, changed with Tardema. And Vayiven, Hashem built something that's also something new that we haven't experienced before in play of Perek Aleph. And I'll leave it the rest to you.
You're emphasizing two very interesting words that enter the narrative in chapter 2 and don't exist in chapter 1. The word Tardema, sleep, which we talked about a little bit already as the eclipse of consciousness in a sense, and the word va'iven. Until this point, when we talk about God, we talk in terms of creation or like yetzirah or bri'ah, right? Va'iven is different somehow because it's not like snap your fingers or say vayehi or and it comes. There's a sense of a gradual process. My brother-in-law, my beloved brother-in-law is a building engineer, a civil engineer, right? Civil engineer. And we had many fascinating conversations about how you build a house, and you can't skip stages. That was my sad conclusion. You may want the building to be built faster, but you don't want it to fall over your head. So once we have this word, va'iven, it kind of introduces a sense of process, a sense of stages into the world. And as we will see, we will put it in a broader context in a minute. This is extremely significant because relationships don't form instantaneously. I mean, people talk about falling in love and we feel attraction and we feel, sometimes I'm sure you had this experience. I had this experience of meeting someone and knowing right away that this person will be meaningful in my life in some capacity. But whether or not it actually happens depends on daily investment, daily compromises, daily making room for the other person in your life and investing in them and then reciprocating this investment in their own way. So there's a bniyah, there's a building, there's a gradual process. And I think you're right that this word also introduces a possibility. I want to now take, and I'm sorry, I apologize that we can't hear everybody's answers. I will, okay, one last one. Yeah. You wanted to say something, right? Yes. I saw you raising your hand from the beginning. I felt bad. Yeah.
The other woman said about, like not sacrifice, like in Rob Dessler, when he talks about relationships, Tina and Tila, taking and giving, when you give of yourself, you give a part of yourself, and that's what you love in that person. That's how it starts, and then you end up a person for who they are. But first, it's the giving, so it's like for his rib, he gives his rib for her, and that's for him, and that's how he loves her.
That's really beautiful. You're in following Rabbi Dessler, you're suggesting, I repeat so everybody can hear, that maybe we can reframe it not as sacrifice, that it's not that he sacrificed his rib, but rather that he gave something of himself. And as Rav Dessler teaches, when you give something of yourself to another person, at first what you love about this person is what you gave them, and then you come to love them as they are. So, in their own merit. I would say more than that. Erich Fromm and his book, The Art of Loving, talks a lot about how people mistakenly think that love is a noun. It's a state, but love is actually a verb that requires work. And in this work, the giving is much more important than the receiving. Now, I can already see the therapists in the crowd perking up and saying, no, you need to have boundaries. It needs to be reciprocal. You need to have self-respect. I know. But let's talk about the beginning. The first part of a relationship is the giving, because when you give, you grow. And I want to take this word grow that I just put here in the room, in the air between us, and focus on that. And say that the thing that differentiates the second chapter of Bereshit from the first chapter of Bereshit, or the second creation story from the first creation story, more than anything else, is that it explores the mechanisms, the dynamics of growth. Let's look at it in box number 2. I have to go back. I'm skipping to the sources from Genesis at the bottom of the box. The first creation, sorry. I will get back to Jane Austen, no worries. I never give up on an opportunity to mention Jane Austen. But in Genesis 1, when we read the beginning of Bereshit Aleph, of the first creation story, it sounded like this. And this time I will read it in Hebrew. You can follow in the English next to it if you want. Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Boom. Short, concise, and to the point. And who is the protagonist? God. It's very clear, right? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. We already know who is the protagonist and what it's about. It's about him creating the heaven and the earth. והארץ הייתה תוהו ובוהו, וחושך על פני תהום, ורוח אלוקים מרחפת על פני המים, ויאמר אלוקים יהי אור, ויהי אור. There's no gap between plan and execution. God says, let there be light, and there is light. In storytelling terms, we would say that there's no conflict. There's no resistance, and there's no conflict. There's no friction. God has a plan. He implements it. There's no antagonist to kind of grumble and try and push the protagonist back. וירא אלוקים את האור כי טוב, ויבדל אלוקים בין האור ובין החושך, ויקרא אלוקים לאור יום ולחושך קרא לילה, ויהי ערב ויהי בוקר יום אחד. God is the creator, both the planner of creation and the executioner of the plan. God is the one who decides, who assigns values to things. It's good, it's bad, that's all on God. God is the one who creates language, right? He calls the light day and the darkness night. And he is the one that defines temporal and spatial spaces. Boom. Only God. God is at the top. Now, where can humanity even fit in here? Where are they supposed to develop a personality, a sense of self, a relation to one another, to discover each other? Where are they supposed to do that in a world that is wholly and fully defined by God's will? There's no space for them. And here I go back to Jane Austen, I promise. In storytelling, we talk about the beginning of a story as forming a contract. This is my other hat, my field as a storyteller and as a researcher of stories. we talk about the beginning of a story as forming a contract between writer and reader, or between storyteller and audience, in which somehow the beginning is supposed to set certain expectations. And it's extremely important to set the correct expectations, because otherwise, me as a reader, I don't know what to pay attention to as a story progresses. I don't know what to be surprised by or what's normal. I don't know what's interesting. I don't know what questions I'm supposed to be asking. I don't have any tools to engage with the stream of information that the story gives me. So when we look at some famous opening lines of stories, they give us this tool. Look at the top. It is a truth universally acknowledged, top of box 2, that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. With this immortal line, Jane Austen in Pride and Prejudice immediately conveys to us that this is going to be a tongue-in-cheek, humorous sort of book, not to that doesn't take itself too seriously, that it's going to have to do with matrimony and wealth, 2 themes that are explored very deeply in the book. And also that it's going to, I mean, this is a little more subtle, that it's going to append some of our expectations about how marriage works. Because it starts by making this obviously false claim about marriage, and it sets us up to start thinking, what are other false opinions about marriage? And we will see how Mr. Darcy's idea that marriage should be based on fortune and connections is false, how Charlotte Collins's idea is false, etc. I'm not gonna, I could talk about Jane Austen all day, but I'll restrain myself. Look at this very different one. I'll actually skip to number 3. It was a feature peculiar to the colonial wars of North America that the toils and dangers of the wilderness were to be encountered before the adverse hosts could meet. Does anyone recognize it? Last of the Mohicans. So already you can tell that this is going to be a very different style than the Jane Austen one, right? Much more serious. It also tells us right away where and when we're going to be. We're going to be in North America at the time of the colonial wars. It gives us a sense of what kind of adversity our heroes should expect. First of all, wilderness. Second of all, adverse hosts. And honestly, if you read the book, that's exactly what takes place. We're going to see how people deal with nature and with armies of enemies in the colonial era in North America. It's pretty much exactly it. Now, we could be doing this all day. I invite you later to read the other openings and look at and see what kind of expectations they set for you. But let's bring it back to Tanakh, which is, after all, why we're here today, to say that the expectations set by Bereshit Aleph to Hey, like the psukim we read together, lead us to expect a story about God. It's not really a story about relationships between people. There's no room for that. Whereas the beginning of the second creation story, if we read it carefully, which we will right now, sets us up to expect a story about relationships and gives us already a hint into what needs to change for us to allow these relationships to emerge. And many of the things that were raised here, we will see are already hinted at here. So I'm looking at the bottom of box 2. אלה תולדות השמיים והארץ בהיברעם, ביום עשות השם אלוקים ארץ ושמיים. Verse 4. Now, I have to say, compare it to בראשית ברא אלוקים את השמיים ואת הארץ. That was such a simple sentence. God was a clear subject of a sentence, and his action was a creation of the world. Here, it's a very convoluted sentence. Such is the story, Toldot, but except Toldot can also mean generations, of heaven and earth when they were created. So it's a story of the heaven and the earth. The heaven and the earth are the subject. They're the protagonists as they're created, not after they're created. When the Lord God made earth and heaven, God is relegated to a clause. God is removed in a sense, even though he's still obviously the creator. No one is taking away his job, his importance in the story. In this story, he is somewhat to the side. I'm thinking about the Hasidic idea of tzimtzum, that God created the world by withdrawing, by diminishing his presence in some way to make room for us. Here, it's really on the language level. On the language level, God is being pushed a little to the margins to make space for something else to emerge. And now let's see what is this that emerges. In verse 5, V'chol siach hasade terem yeh ba'aretz. V'chol eseb hasade terem yitzamach. When no shrub of the field was yet on earth, and no grasses of the field had yet sprouted. So we are informed that the point in which we enter the story is when the world is not complete. The word not yet, or in Hebrew, one word, terem, appears twice. And it's such a pregnant word because it immediately gives us a sense that something will be. With that, it introduces to the world the idea of process, like the word va'iven that comes later in the same chapter, as was noted. It's words that imply that things don't happen instantaneously. It doesn't happen vayehi o, vayehi o. It's not like that. There's a process that has to happen. Now, what we find out next is that this process, just like we said about building a building, can't skip stages. Certain stages need to be met before the others can come into fruition. And here, fruition is the appropriate words because we're talking about seeds. The world is a word of seeds, of potential, and they need to grow into plants that later can give fruit. What are the conditions that have to be met? What's the stage that has to be passed before we reach that stage? Ki lo hemtir, I'm still in Pasuk Hey. Ki lo hemtir Hashem Elokim ala haaretz. Condition number 1, God didn't bring rain yet. There has to be rain. Ve'adam ain la'avod et ha'adama. And there is no man to till the soil. Immediately, before we even meet humanity, because humanity at this stage is not on earth yet, ain, Adam ain. But we already know, just looking at it like this, that humanity is going to have a creative role in the process that brings the world from potential to actuality. We are no longer dropped into the world at its end when it's all perfect, when it's all prepared and just told to use it, like Adam, the male and female Adam in the first creation story. No, we are created in a world into a world that needs us, where we have to play a crucial and creative role. This description, in terms of the expectations it sets, right? Like compared to Jane Austen and Jenny Moore Cooper, whatever, Fenimore Cooper, implies or brings into our mind or fosters several expectations. The expectation that things take time and there are processes that have to take place. The expectation that humanity has a significant speaking part in the drama that's about to play and a creative role in it. The expectation that there's going to be some sort of relationship between humanity and God. It's not just God creates us, but we partner in the process of the creation of the world in some way. So even if we never speak to one another, we are somehow in relation to one another. And it also creates the expectation that once man does show up, he's going to experience deprivation and difficulty because he's not going to show up into a perfect world that's just waiting for him to drop into. He's going to show up in a world where he's going to have to put in leg work and arm work to make things ready for himself. I think that anyone who's ever been in a healthy and unhealthy relationship can say that a relationship where people are willing to work for it, to go through the hard time and do something to improve the relationship is much more likely to succeed. You can't really develop a relationship when people just expect it to just fall onto their lap in a complete form. So already, just in these very few psukim, we are giving a lot of hints to what needs to be in the world, what kind of world we need to inhabit for it to be a world where a relationship can take place. And now, with these expectations in mind, we can look more carefully at man's progress, Adam's progress, from being created to the relationship and see how he develops the necessary capacities, the necessary skills. If you look at box number 3, you will see that this theme or that plot line of men experiencing deprivation, men finding himself in a world that isn't quite ready for him, continues throughout the creation story of Genesis 2. First of all, man creates man, but then instead of having place ready for him, God focuses on creating the place where man is going to live. Vayita Hashem Elokim, I'm at the top of box 3, Gan be'eden mikedem, vayasem sham et ha'adam asher yatzar. So men had the experience of existing in the world before Eden and after Eden, within Eden. He is not created into Eden where he can just take it for granted. He's created into a world that has seeds in the ground and no food, told to wait for a second, and then move to a better world. Later, after God puts him in this garden, God introduces the order of not to eat from Etz Hadat. Vayetzav Hashem Elokim, in the second source in box through, Al ha'adam le'emor, mikol etz hagan achol tochel, u'me'etz hadat tov hara lo tochel mimeno, ki beyom ochlecha mimeno mot tamut. Now, Rabbi Soloveitchik, we're not going to read the source, but it's here in box number 4, talks about this moment as a crucial moment in the development of man's awareness of his own limitations. Because if all God wanted was to stop man from eating the fruit, he could have put a fence. Thank you. He could have put a fence around it, right? God could make it that man couldn't eat the fruit, but that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is that the fruit is there for the taking, and man has to make the daily choice not to take it, not to give in. That requires a development of self-discipline, of an awareness of the gap between desire and execution, an awareness of his own boundaries, an awareness of his relationship with God. You know, we talk about a relationship before there's a relationship with other humans, that there's a relationship with God. I would take it a step farther, and I would say that I don't think it's any coincidence that God does that before he creates the woman. Because he is teaching man, he's teaching Adam here, that not everything that is pleasant to look at and desirable is yours to consume. He is creating in us, in humanity, he's embedding in us the sense that when we look at the world, it's not just a collection of objects to be used, but rather we have to consider what's ours to use and what's not ours. What's okay to pursue and what's not okay to pursue. And when woman walks onto the stage, men has already went through this mini training, in a sense, and is capable of seeing her as another subject, another human being, subject in a sense of not object, not subject in the sense of subject of a king, sorry. He's capable of looking at another agent in the world and thinking where her consent and her desire fits into his desires or into what he would like from her. And then, let's say we read it like that and he's prepared for the next stage. Still, God makes man experience deprivation, because in the third source in box 3, ויאמר השם אלוקים, לא טוב היות האדם לבדו, אעשה לו עזר כנגדו. Right? It's not good for men to be alone, I shall create a helpmate. If this was Bereshit Aleph, with its super direct narrative and no objections, no friction, no delays, the next pasuk would have been, so God created the woman. But that's not what happens. Instead, ויצר השם אלוקים מן האדמה כל חיית השדה ואת כל עוף השמיים ויבא אל האדם לראות מה יקרא לו וכל אשר יקרא לו האדם נפש חיה הוא שמו. God creates the animals and the birds and brings them to man to see what man will call them, and the names man call him stick. Again, man has a creative role. He partners with God. He's not just enjoying the world as is. But what happens through this process is that God's awareness of how alone man is becomes man's awareness of how alone he is. ויקרא האדם שמות לכל הבהמה ולעוף השמיים ולכל חיית השדה, ולאדם לא מצא עזר כנגדו. In the beginning of this paragraph that's quoted here, God has an insight from the outside into how alone man is. By the end of this process, man shares this awareness because man saw that none of these animals are the appropriate helpmate for him, allowing us to understand what it is that he means when he says, Zot apam, this time, it's mine. This time she's really part of me. This time she's the appropriate helpmate. I'll open for questions in a bit, okay? Where does this leave us? This leaves us with an Adam who is slowly and gradually becoming aware of the fact that the world is a complicated place, that not everything is within his power to achieve, that something is missing, a certain companionship that should be there is missing. And through that, he develops the ability to recognize that missing something when it walks into his life, but also the necessary tools to maintain a relationship. The knowing to appreciate Isha, right? If he doesn't appreciate that she is the answer to all his needs, he wouldn't treat her right. The ability to recognize that he is a human being in himself before there's a relationship, that he has moral responsibilities before he's part of a relationship. Also, a very important precondition for healthy relationships, that you can't just throw your, he fails later, right? When he eats the fruit, he says, oh, it's the woman you gave me. But there's the potential, there's an invitation here to think of, to be aware of his duty and who he is in the world, not in relation to her, and then come and build something with her as an independent unit. There's also the ability to think of himself, the ability to reflect on who he is and what he is, that comes from comparison, from seeing that he's not part of nature in the same way that everything else is. And I would like to read in box number 5 how Rabbi Soloveitchik describes it. In the bottom of box number 5, when he begins to wonder what nature is and tries to understand it, he abandons the identity and unity of man and his environment and finds himself encountering it as a stranger and outsider. At this point, man discovers in himself an incommensurability with nature. He views nature not from within, but from without. When man breaks with immediacy and takes a look at nature from a distance, he encounters a reality which is not only outside of himself, but also opposed to him. He is required to venture into an alien sphere. Rabbi Soloveitchik uses the terms man natura and man persona to describe this process, that the man created in Genesis 1, the Adam created in Genesis 1, is part of nature. His urges are natural. His existence is an existence of DNA and instincts and hormones. And we all have that part within ourselves. No matter what they tell you, we do. We really, really do. But we also have the ability to look at the world and through an experience of aloneness, of seeing how we don't quite fit in with the birds and the cats and the dogs and even other people at times, we start to develop a self-awareness of ourselves as individuals, of persona. And it is only individuals, not generic humans, that can enter our relationship. It is only individuals who can, and I'm going back to box 1, upon seeing another human being and feeling a sense of recognition, make a declaration, זאת הפעם עצם מעצמי ובשר מבשרי, לזאת יקרא אישה, כי מאיש לוקחה זאת. Only human beings have the ability to transform themselves in joining a relationship and embracing a life of transformation, of constant growth, constant transformation together. However, well, this all sounds very optimistic and, what a beautiful invitation for relationship, teaching us to value all these things, process, aloneness, space, boundaries, beautiful manual, like print out for a Kala and give it to her before her wedding. As anyone who ever read Parashat Bereshit knows, this is not where things stay. And before we talk about that a little bit, I wanted to just ask if there's questions, comments before we continue. You wanted to say something earlier. Yes.
Read, okay, yeah. In Bereshit, Vayomer Hashem Elokim lo tov hayat adam levado. So it's not, it seems to, in this paragraph, I don't see that man realizes that he needs a helpmate. God said, oh, it's not good for man to be alone, I'm gonna make something for him. And then he makes all these animals and Adam names them. And then, but he didn't find any fitting, whatever, and they're gonna go for Adam. God didn't find somebody that was fitting to be in a relationship with Adam. I don't see where Adam
I'll explain.
feels that he's missing something.
So I'll repeat briefly.
Though.
I'll repeat briefly and explain why I'm reading it the way I'm reading. You're pointing out that in box 3 at the bottom, source, when God creates the animals and man names them, it doesn't ever say, and man saw that he didn't find a helpmeet. That's correct. I agree with you. If you just read just the text and not the subtext, you're right. I think that the reason I think that man comes to feel it, and you're right, there's a little bit of drash involved, that's not fully pshat, is that why would God make Adam go through this process? I mean, why make Adam go through the process? God knows that none of these animals is going to match with Adam. God knows because he created them this way, right? He is the creator. He is the omniscient, omnipotent creator at this point, especially after Bereshit Aleph with its march of creation with no objection or hesitation, right? So it's almost as if he's trying to make Adam go through a certain experience. It seems to me not a stretch to say that the experience is that by the end, when it says Adam lo matza ezel kenegdo, Adam can feel something of that. Adam can see, he looks a couple of lions, a couple of zebras, a couple of snakes. We're after Noach, we're trained to think of couples. It's a little wrong in the animal kingdom, but let's say couples. And he sees, he is there to experience it. You're right that it doesn't say it explicitly, but I think it is somewhat subtly implied. Accept or don't, that's fine. It's not anything else? Yes. Say it again.
So man, the first in the parent out, it only uses Elohim. In parent base, you say Hashem Elohim. So the question is this indicative of man's feeling some change in terms of man's relationship to nature because of the addition of the Hashem?
Sorry, is there an alarm? Is there a siren? Oh, okay. Sorry, just make sure we're in the right place and doing the right thing. Okay. God willing, all our brothers and sisters up north, I pray and hope that they'll all be safe. And also Tel Aviv. Okay. Well, may our brothers and sisters wherever they are be safe. And let's continue. Sorry. Yes. Yeah, what's your name? Papi? What is good? But what's your first name again? I'm sorry. Papi. Bavi. Okay, that makes more sense. Okay, Bavi is pointing out, nice to meet you. Bavi is pointing out that the name of God changes. That in Perek Aleph, we hear of Elokim, Elokim, Elokim. Then we hear Hashem Elokim, Hashem Elokim. You even point out the nice gematria that Elokim and Teva are the same. It's almost like equivalent in some way, but then Hashem introduces a new type of divinity. Rav Mordechai Breuer makes a lot from this change in his commentary on Bereshit, and saying that there's different aspects of God, and in Bereshit Aleph, only one aspect comes into play. God is the creator, God is the powerful, God is the kind of the driving force. And in Perek Bet, along the tzimtzum of allowing process in the world and allowing partnership with humanity, other aspects of God start coming into play. I think that fits very well with the issue of relationship, because it's very hard to have a relationship with a God who's constantly just the driving force. So by introducing a complexity in himself, a duality almost, right? We believe that God is one, but the way he reveals himself to us is now more complicated, more dialectic. God is enabling us to think in a more sophisticated way about our place in relation to him and then in relation to one another. In general, the second you introduce variety and differences and distinctions, it invites people to think in a more complicated way about their place in relation to the world, to God, to other people. Another something that I think we're familiar with from watching teenagers go through a relationship, where it's not just that they think it has to be perfect all the time, or that it has to drop into their lap perfectly ready, etc., or that they're always right. I'm sorry, I have young teenagers at home, as you might see. I'm working through my frustrations. They're wonderful, don't get me wrong, but but there's a certain rigidity at that age, let's be honest. But there's also a sense of black and white, of things must be either good or bad, right or wrong. And part of growing up is introducing, well, there's good in this way and good in that way. There's God, but there's God the judge and God the merciful, God the king and God the father. There's place for more. And that I think definitely has a big part in it. So thank you. Yes. This is not a siren. Yay. All good. All good. Just a minute. Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I just can't hear you.
Seems to suggest complexity.
Yes.
Not with the other. Something simple.
That is very well spotted. And I want to talk about that for a second. Let's go to box 6, okay? In page 5. And that actually leads us to where I wanted to wrap up. So I'll follow on that. At the top of box 6. ויאמר השם אלוקים לא טוב היות האדם לבדו אעשה לו עזר כנגדו. As you point out, sorry, what's your name? Helen? As Helen points out, this in and of itself, just the way God describes the role that God's companion, man's companion is going to play, already introduces complexity in different aspects, because it says ezer kenegdo, not ezer letzido, someone who can be his sidekick, shoulder to shoulder, not ezer me'achorav, someone who can propel him, ezer kenegdo, standing across from him. This implies at once the intimacy of eyes meeting eyes, right? Of people looking at each other, exactly the thing that wasn't there in Bereshit Aleph at all, right? When they didn't look at each other, when they were just dropped into the world as is. But it also introduces the idea of mikud, the idea of difference, the idea of tension. As Rashi very famously says, in the second source in box 6, Zacha Ezer lo zacha kenegdo lehilachem. If he is worthy, she shall be a help to him. If he is unworthy, she shall be opposed to him to fight him. I want to point out, we all know that men and women are not treated the same in Gemara. Let's not mince words. Yes, we're not seen as, I don't want to use the word equal, as the same. We're seen as different, and the difference comes with legal ramifications and inequalities and differences. But note that the responsibility for the quality of the relationship here is not placed on Chava, is placed on Adam. Man may be the first, right? And he may be the one who names Eve. Like there's a certain, she doesn't get to name him, and we'll talk about that in a second. But with that comes the responsibility to set the tenor of the relationship. In choosing her and recognizing her as his in some way, he is put in the position to determine what kind of relationship they're going to have from now on. I think there's a very deep message here for us, even though our relationships and the world we live in is very different from the world in which the Gemara was written. But I think what it teaches us is that when things go sour in a relationship, before we ask what the other partner did, let's ask what was the thing we conveyed? What did we merit or not merit in the relationship? And I want to take that tension, the Ezer Kenegdo, and wrap up this part of the story. And then we'll continue next week with the same source sheet, with the second arc of Adam and Chava's story, with the story of the exile from Eden and everything that befell them. But before we even get to this part of the story, before we even get to the distressing developments to follow, I want to note that the second story of creation may introduce the conditions for relationship, the conditions for what Judy Klitzner in her book calls tenderness, right? Intimacy, because man who was alone is capable of recognizing the importance of woman and be tender, have intimacy with her in a way that a man who feels wholly complete in and of itself is not. But at the same time, it introduces another whole thing, another whole aspect that wasn't there at all in Genesis 1, and that's inequality. Because in Genesis 1, the male and the female are created together, and they're ordered by God together, and they're left to rule over the earth together, and to eat whatever grasses they want together equally. But in the second story, man is created first. Man is placed in a position to partner with God in tilling the soil and in naming all the animals. Man is made to go through all the experiences that build within him the skills to make space for a relationship, to appreciate growth, to have boundaries, to differentiate between wanting and taking, to do all those things we've been discussing here for the past hour. Man is giving all these opportunities, but woman is created for him. Her entire existence is as his help, someone that's created for man. And she's not given the same opportunities of learning and growth because she's created into a world where he already exists. He names her, he exclaims with this awe and joy about her, but she remains silent. And Shira Weiss-Wolosky wrote an article about this called The Lonely Woman of Faith, because Rabbi Soloveitchik talks in The Lonely Man of Faith a lot about Adam and how important loneliness is to grow as a spiritual human being. And Shira asks, what about woman? Why did woman not get the same chance to grow? Why is she subservient and relational to men? Now, again, if we're talking about these stories as paradigmatical, there's no question that it captures the experience of many women throughout history, right? Women were seen as a part of their father's household and then moving to a husband's household. Most women in history didn't get an opportunity to make it out on their own, and figure out who they are and have a hero's journey in which they leave behind Artzecha u'Moladetcha v'Beit Avicha and discover on their own who they are. I mean, Rivka left Artza u'Moladetcha v'Beit Avicha to marry Yitzchak. That was the journey. That was the mystique of leaving home, that you move into the world of devakt ba'alech. But the question, and I want to leave you with a question, we're not going to try and answer it now because this will be a lot of what we'll discuss next week, is how does this fact, the fact that Chava, who's not named Chava, who's named Isha, didn't go through all these formative experiences that prepared Adam for a relationship, play a role in the disappointing turn of events that followed? And I want to leave you with this thought and thank you for learning with me today. And I hope to see you next week with these source sheets so we can continue the second act of the story. May we hear only Besorot Tovot, God willing.